When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own. Not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. Not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. So none of them can hurt me. No one can implicate me in ugliness, nor can I feel angry at my relative or hate him. We were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like the two rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are obstructions. Yo, discard your thirst for books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Discard your thirst for books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Discard your thirst for books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Whatever this is that I am, it is flesh, a little spirit, and intelligence. Throw away your books. Stop letting yourself be distracted. That is not allowed. Instead, as if you were dying right now, despise your flesh, a mess of blood, pieces of bone, a woven tangle of nerves, veins, arteries. Consider what the spirit is, air, and never the same air, but vomited out and gulped in again every instant. Finally, the intelligence. Think of it this way, you are an old man. Stop allowing your mind to be a slave, to be jerked about by selfish impulses, to kick against fate and the present, to mistrust the future. What is divine is full of providence. Even chance is not divorced from nature, from the inweaving and infolding of things governed by providence. Everything proceeds from it. And then there is necessity and the needs of the whole world, of which you are a part. Whatever the nature of the whole does and whatever serves to maintain it is good for every part of nature. The world is maintained by change in the elements and in the things they compose. That should be enough for you. Treat it as an axiom. Discard your thirst for books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Discard your thirst for books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Discard your thirst for books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. What a glorious thing, waking up in the morning, baby. Oh, what a glorious thing, you get to have a whole day. Hey, oh, what a glorious thing, waking up in the morning, baby. Oh, what a glorious thing, you get to have a whole day. Discard your favorite books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Discard your favorite books so you won't die in bitterness, but in cheerfulness and truth. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Grateful to the gods from the bottom of your heart. Remember how long you've been putting this off? How many extensions the gods gave you and you didn't use them? At some point you have to recognize what world it is that you belong to, what power rules it and from what source you spring, that there's a limit to the time assigned to you, and if you don't use it to free yourself, it will be gone and will never return.
Okay, who's ready for a brand new series? Year one, we are starting Philosophy of Religion. We're going to be here meeting Mondays at this time. Every week, it's taking up the Friday I'm sorry, Fridays at this time every week. It's taking up our usual Friday time slot for doing the backbone course of the year one material. Normie, please don't be on wires, baby. Come here. Come here. He's such a dope. Okay. I'm really excited. This is going to be really fun. So let's jump into it. We're going to do a lot like what we did yesterday. We're going to do an overview and talk about the course and what we're going to cover. So, first, though, we're going to have to talk about some big questions here, which is what the heck exactly is the relationship between philosophy and theology, philosophy and mysticism, philosophy and religion? What do we like? Religion's a pretty big category. Philosophy is a pretty big category. Philosophy includes ethics, it includes metaphysics. We've been seeing in our 101 backbone course how intertwined all these different questions are. We also have been hinting at something we're going to stress a lot in year two, which is the conversations that are happening between philosophy and philosophers, but also camps of philosophers and ongoing chronologically, historically in a narrative. And so there's conversations within philosophy, there's conversations within religion, and then there's also conversations between the two. So, saying something as simple as the philosophy of religion, it's not exactly the same as the philosophy of biology, right? There's a very different relationship going on here. So, um, we could ask some big questions before we even get into the types of questions we're going to be asking now. Very broad questions. What is religion? What is theology? What is the prophetic? What is doctrinal? What is mysticism? What about revelation? There's a lot of different ways of being religious. And those things are all communicating with each other inside the breast of every religious person, inside the tradition of their faith, between in the conversations between their faiths and other faiths. So, what the heck is the philosophy of religion course? Well, here's what our course is going to be like. We're going to look at a two-way conversation between, admittedly, this very, very large sphere over here and this very large subdividable into different disciplines sphere on the right. Um, so yeah, we said like there's a mystical and a doctrinal in religion. There's a conversation between the two. There's a conversation between the prophetic and the official religious traditions. There's conversations between one tradition and another. Those are just three dynamics. I just threw three up there. There's plenty of them. There's also conversations in philosophy between materialistic and metaphysical, between Platonic and Aristotelian, between lots and lots of different ways that we can see conversations, intra conversations in both of these, but we're going to try to be looking at, so it makes the question, how do you communicate between these two, complicated because which part of which one is communicating with which part of the other? And of course, all of them are available, but that's a pretty big umbrella. So we're going to we're going to talk briefly about how philosophy and religion as a big umbrella term might relate to each other, and then we're going to narrow down what we're going to be discussing in this course. So I said before, the relationship between the philosophy and the sciences, I think, now this is just my view, so none of this is gospel, but I think that it's more like top down. Philosophy invents and then governs over the sciences. I'm not going to go into that too much unless people want to ask and talk about it. So feel free to ask questions about that and make me defend it a bit. It's not something anybody has to believe, obviously. But my view is that, the natural philosophers come first. They clarify the notions well enough until suddenly uh there's a, well, not suddenly, until the development of a philosophical lens or a paradigm is it makes is emerges and then makes possible thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of questions within a framework that are now amenable to empirical consequence. And then we just send the scientists off like our GIMP slaves to go, solve all those little questions or something. And then while they're doing that, they have to sort of have a framework and maintain certain concepts that we handed to them. And they just sort of take those as gospel because those are the tools they have to use to make progress inside their field. But then philosophy can look at what they're doing and say, okay, when the biologist says you are nothing but the expression of your genes, here's how much that means, here's what it could mean, here's what it might not mean, here's the ways in which it's limited. I'm sorry, there's conversations here. Okay. Hey, awesome, awesome, awesome. Another beautiful day. Goddamn, excuse my language. You darn right it is. Okay. Good. So that's one thing. I think the relationship between philosophy and whatever umbrella term we're calling religion here, we could call it, you know, the relationship between the poetic, the mythological, the mystical, the revelatory, I think it's more of a peer conversation. And like I said before, it's a two-way conversation. Now, what's interesting here is that this is by no means a sketch of all the different subjects, right? The mathematicians think they're way up here. Maybe they're a weird nerdy subcategory of logic or something. So I'm not trying to flush out the whole thing here. I'm just trying to show that a relationship between philosophy and religion that's more like sister and brother communicating rather than schoolmaster governing over the children or something like that. Psychology is an interesting subject I felt like throwing in here because sometimes it's dream interpretation, mythology, and Jungian archetypes. Sometimes it's trying to be a philosophy. Sometimes it's trying to be a science. It's possible, we won't defend this unless people want to ask, but it's possible to imagine that all of mathematics is trying to discover the sophisticated structures that are possible to instantiate within the human mind. And so it's a branch of the exploration of psychology. Psychology is a weird one, but I felt like throwing that in there because, like I said, it's having a conversation. It's almost like there's 3 siblings here having a conversation, and psychology is almost like the Holy Spirit. It's like a shape-shifting thing. We're not, depending on which psychologist you're talking about, you might be in Jungian poetic mythology, you might be in philosophical realm, you might be in a scientific behavioralist type of realm. It's not clear, but let's get back to the idea of philosophy and religion. All right, so none of this is gospel, and it's certainly not a well worked out structure or hierarchy of the subjects relating to each other. The only point of the limited amount of this that I put together was to sort of show the peer relationship between philosophy and what we're going to call religion for now. Okay, we said there's a two-way conversation. What do we mean? Well, the concepts that theologians have about God are sometimes sophisticated, altered, changed, benefited from criticism from without, criticism from the philosophical realm. Also, there are certain philosophical problems and certain logical developments of logic and other things that philosophy has adopted that came directly from theologians. Right? And then there's theologians who are doing theology, looking at the Bible verses or the revelation and trying to use logic and reason to figure out, what the right way to think about those things are, who then say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go put on this philosopher's cap. I'm going to come over here like St. Thomas Aquinas or Ghazali did. I'm going to write a philosophy book. I'm not going to appeal to revelation. I'm not going to appeal to things like that. I'm going to play the game of the philosophers. And sometimes they write very devastating, very comprehensive, very important, so they're sort of sending letters over from the realm of religion over to philosophy, and then philosophy is sometimes benefiting from and sophisticated, and it's like there's really this back and forth that's happening from both of them, I think. So we'll talk about, I'm happy to defend or even abandon some of those basic cartoonish structures of the way these things relate to each other that I gave earlier there. If anybody wants to talk more about it, I'm just very briefly trying to introduce the idea that there's a relationship here. And of course, what we're going to be doing is philosophy, right? So there's not really going to be any mysticism or appeal to revelation or anything like that. To do philosophy, you just have to use, or you have to stick to the rules of right reason, unless, of course, you're one of the really great philosophers who, oh, yeah, that's another thing we could say. Uh, there are certainly philosophers who use literature and mythology in order to communicate some great truths that they think they've come to. And so they become quasi religious or religious figures. And we've talked a lot about some of those, but uh, it wasn't without thought that I believe I heard recently that the Catholic Church, I'm sure a while ago, decided Socrates had saving grace, right? So if we go into their terminology and their framework, we say, okay, well, you didn't do that haphazardly. Um, Nietzsche is prophesying, right? So there's that's not metaphor. I mean, it's not metaphor. It's not metaphor in the pejorative sense, but it's he's not joking when he says that's what he's doing, right? So there's a lot of interest. Maybe we shouldn't have drawn these two spheres so far away from each other. Maybe there's just a lot of overlap in the Venn diagram here. In any case, we can't, so what we're talking about now is just how big each of these subjects are and how complicated it would be to take. What if we looked at religion from the philosophical perspective of ethics? Well, what if we looked at ethics from the philosophical consequences of the existence of God? Right? Like you can go back and forth. It's a very rich conversation, series of conversations that's happening between the two. Let's talk about what we're going to limit ourselves to considering in this course, and we're going to cover quite a lot. So we're going to talk generally about philosophy and religious belief. Okay. Let's skip that section for a moment. Then we're going to do something that's a meta ethical, a meta philosophical or a meta religious conversation. We're going to talk about the problem of God talk. So just like the meta-ethical question that we were considering recently in the Backbone course, this isn't theology and it isn't philosophy of religion. It's the philosophy of religion, right? It's the conversation about like, wait a minute, when you say God stuff, does it mean anything? Is it properly grounded? Is it properly basic? Is it ungroundable? Is it meaningless? Like that type of thing. We're going to spend a brief amount of time looking at that. And then when we look at that from a bunch of different angles, we're going to get into the arguments for the existence of God. We're going to get into the concept of God. Okay, so the concept of God, there's this thing called the God of the philosophers, and then there's a different kind of a God that is, well, there's certainly philosophers who believe in that second kind of a God, by the way, but there's this um, ongoing conversation between theology and philosophy. And one of the things it's done is there's been a revision and sophistication and perhaps introduction of a bunch of errors. I mean, we're not saying that the philosophy side has it right, but of ways of conceiving of God. So we're going to look at that. Then we're going to look at the problem of evil, which is, of course, an argument against the existence of God. We're going to look at the relationship between ethics, philosophical subject of ethics and religion, and then we're going to look at immortality. However, this is a little misleading because we're not going to be spending the same amount of time on the meta philosophical conversation as we do on the rest of this. So let's get an idea of how much we're going to be spending time on each of these things. Um, just one moment. I'm going to make a comment here. Okay. So in our first section on the philosophy and religious belief, I said I'd skip that. Let's come back to it. We're going to talk about questions of whether or not it's appropriate to have belief, right? There's a one of the stark and salient distinctions between philosophy and religion is that theology and religion are often based in faith, and if you say to a philosopher, well, I know you just asked me to give you an argument for what I just said, but the whole point is that I don't have an argument for it. You're clearly not playing the same game, or it's not clear that you're playing the same game. And so there are philosophers who are saying, no, actually, that's what you should be doing, right? So we can argue everything in philosophy, and there's going to be philosophers saying, no, it's properly basic. It's not to be grounded in anything other than what it is. And then there's going to be people who say, no, the proper thing to do is to just assume atheism. And if you can't know it in the way we want to try to know things, then it's not worth knowing, or it's not knowable, or something like that. So we're just basically going to put the whole of religion and the idea of faith itself a little bit on the scales, and we're going to look at it from different perspectives. Then we're going to spend a brief amount of time looking at the problem of God talk. Uh, one of the things we'll do in the first section is also a linguistics approach, right? So that's going to lead us right um, into the problem of God talk section. But we're going to say, we're finite creatures. We're trying to talk about the infinite. Is that Can we know ahead of time that that is n- not going to be a completable project, or it's a problematic project for reasons that we could predict? Um, Questions like that. Then we're going to get into, and we've done a little bit of each of these before. I think we might change the sections up and start with the ontological because I think it just flows the most easily. We'll probably do the ontological, then the cosmo design, and then experience ones. But We're going to look at the familiar categories of the arguments of God's existence. I'm sure we're going to look at some arguments that say you shouldn't have arguments for God's existence. It should be faith based and that type of thing. But then we're going to get into this interesting field of what is God, and we don't talk about God having characteristics in philosophy. We talk about him having attributes. And part of the reason why we talk about him having attributes is this really, really interesting fourth one that we're going to look at a little bit called simple. The simplicity of God means that his omnipotence is the same as his love, is the same as his omniscience, is the same as his justice, that he doesn't have different qualities to him. What he has are things we attribute to him in our finiteness to try to understand the one thing that it's just one thing that he is. The oneness of him is a similar notion to the simplicity, but it's a simplicity. We'll talk more about it. It's a very interesting concept that is helpful in other realms of philosophy, as we've already seen come up. Then we're going to deal with the problem of evil. We're going to look at some ethical stuff and more and mortality and immortality. But here's what I mean. We've got like 7 essays we're going to read in the just general ideas of faith and ethics and linguistics and is it groundable? Should you just be a skeptic? Should you be an atheist? Like what we're going to kind of judge faith a little bit in that first section with 7 essays. And then when we do the meta philosophy of religion conversation, we're only going to be looking at 4, but they're really, really good 4 articles that sort of are responding to each other. So it's kind of a very brief connect the dots version of a conversation that's going to lead us right into the rest of everything else. What are the problems of even trying to talk about God? Is this something that we can know ahead of time is not something we're going to be able to wrap our minds around in the first place? Does that mean that there's something meaningless or absurd about the language we're using? Um, is it evident nonsense? Is it not evident nonsense? There's clearly some responses happening here. And then there's this sort of materialistic idea. And there's a lot of ideas that are going to be presented from lots of different perspectives in these 4 essays. It's going to get us off to a really nice start. But then we're going to do a much deeper dive than we did in the 101 course into these different arguments for God's existence. So it looks like I love this. We go from the 11th to the 13th to the 14th century looking at cosmological arguments. Then we look at a modern version of the cosmological arguments. Then we look at objections to it, more objections to it. We say, well, wait a minute, is this just fundamentally flawed? Is this Do we always posit a cause, but there doesn't have to be one, kind of a thing? Um, And then there's a very interesting article that section ends with called "Can There Be an Endless Regress of Causes?" And there's a suggestion that perhaps there could be, right? Usually in philosophy, we talk about, well, you can't have an infinite regress, right? As soon as you realize your argument got you to an infinite regress, you say, okay, well, that wasn't as fruitful as I thought it would be. There's a very interesting suggestion in that essay that there's a different way of thinking about, a non-temporal link of causality. We'll move on from that now, but that's going to be an interesting one. Then there's the design arguments, and one thing that we discovered that was fascinatingly interesting in our 101 course, or our intro backbone part to all of this, was the fact that Paley predicted all of the parts of Darwin's theory before Darwin was born, and I was really shocked to discover that in the writing. But we'll be looking at an essay by Paley here. But you see, we're gonna have like 6 articles discussing this idea from different angles instead of just 1 or 2 like we did in the intro part. Then the ontological arguments, which again, I think we're gonna do first before we do anything with the cosmological, because I think there, you know, I think there's something very interesting about the ontological arguments, and I think they're a lot stronger than people think they are. I don't mean that they're correct. What I mean to say is it's very easy not to understand the ontological argument and then to think that you've argued it away, or you've found a good reason to dismiss it, or that you agree with it without really fully understanding it. And so and it's a very interesting argument when once it's actually understood. It's extremely powerful for um aiding other, it's a powerful tool for other philosophical realms to comprehend the ontological arguments correctly. So I think we might even start there and then do Cosmo and design. And then there's, of course, the conversation about human experience, like direct experience of God. So we look at an essay called "Why Knowing God by Experience is a Notion Open to Question." Can we know God by experience? Is that something that's that could happen? Why should there not be experience of God? So again, it's a back and forth conversation between between a few different contributors. But then we get into the section on the notion of the divine and how it's been altered, sophisticated. There's been a back and forth conversation between theologians, philosophers of religion, um, mystics, like all of the different ways that you can be in either of these two camps. The conversation has been ongoing, and it's been fruitful, and it has changed the way we think about God, or at least offered ways of thinking about God that might be true, might be false, might be a product of the limitations of our minds while we're trying to make sense of things. So we put it into something that can be comprehended by us. But we'll see. We'll see what we think about this. So we're going to look at omnipotence, omniscience, eternality or everlastingness, because there's a debate about whether or not one of those is correct or the other. But then we're going to look at simplicity. We're going to really make sure that we understand that because it's an interesting notion. Then we'll move on to the problem of evil, ethics, and immortality. So most of this course is now I want to say something about this part of the course here, this the largest sections of the course are clearly not conversations about is all of this meaningless, although we have David Hume showing up, we have people arguing against each of these arguments for God's existence. I want to make it clear that nobody has to believe in God in order to benefit from this class and this conversation, right? I mean, David Hume's going to show up, Kant's going to show up. uh, I think we have Russell, Bertrand Russell, I think, shows up here. Yeah, he does. We have plenty of atheists and skeptics who are showing up to point out the weaknesses of the arguments. Uh, that's what it's about, right? We're trying to understand the arguments, and we're going to benefit from it. Now, we might change our positions over time as individuals about this whole God thing. We might say, oh, now that I really understand the arguments for God's existence, I no longer believe in them. They're weaker than I thought they were. Or maybe we'll say, oh, I thought there wasn't a God, but I certainly didn't have this concept of God as a thing in my mind in the first place. I'm not sure if that thing exists, even though I think this other thing doesn't exist. And, the whole conversation is super fruitful, no matter where we start from and no matter where we end up from. And of course, obviously, we shouldn't have to say this, but none of this is about trying to get us to think a certain thing. It's about sophisticating our arguments for or against the existence of God. And, we're going to be having voices from all sorts of perspectives throughout all of this. So, uh, I say that because we're spending so much time talking about qualities and attributes of God, and you say to yourself, "Well, do I just have to be a believer to even want to do this course?" That's not the case. The way these essays interact with each other, it's clear that um, part of it is saying, well, does the eternality of God lead to a contradiction, which means that he couldn't exist at all? Or is the right way to conceptualize it like this because that doesn't lead to a contradiction? So none of this requires anybody to be in a certain faith or to even to have any faith in order to be interested in it and to benefit from it. Now, uh, these are color coded for the actual section, so we are going to do a little bit of that meta philosophy stuff and try to see, can we even have a conversation about this? Which, by the way, I think this is a much more interesting meta conversation than the meta ethical one that we were looking at in the Backbone course. Quite frankly, this really leads nicely into making us ask the types of questions we need to ask ourselves, because there's a presumption that can happen from religious people where they think, "Oh yeah, this God thing, it's like the cartoon idea I had as a kid," and maybe that's correct. And maybe if you have personal experience with God, there's an element of that. I'm not trying to spit on any of it or insult it, but it's certainly possible not to ask ourselves how sure we are about our conceptions in the first place, or about how confident we should be when we're speaking about things like this. And I think the same applies to people who are glibly atheistic. I think by going through a course like this, you will be a sophisticated believer or a more sophisticated non-believer by the end of it. Um, and I think that's really valuable. So it's going to be fun. Um, I do remember going through this book, and I think that the collection of these essays really do flow well together. I really liked this a lot more than I liked the book that I agreed to go through with the backbone course. I think we're in very good hands as far as the flow of all of this goes. Um, so I'm excited about that. These are the voices we're gonna start hearing, and, Aquinas, we're gonna read 9 pieces by him. Most of the rest, we're gonna read 1 or at most 4. There's, 2, 3, or 4 from a few of them. But these are the voices that are going to be contributing to the conversation that we consider here, some of them more than others, some of them not nearly enough, in my view. We're going to have plenty of time to talk about the sources for diving deeper into different individuals' perspectives. That's going to be something we're going to talk about. This is a more thorough survey of the field of the philosophy of religion than we did with our 101 section, our backbone course that we had finished already on God's existence, which again, I think that was the most interesting of the sections we've done so far, quite frankly. And I've been really looking forward to this class for a long time. Um, there are ideas in here that if you've been religious your entire life, you've probably never considered. And I don't mean like attacks on your religion or reasons not to believe in God. I mean conceptions of God that you've just never even thought about before that are going to come up, and you're going to say, "Wow, that's really different from what I thought God was like." And maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's going to help us to understand just how different it how possible it is to think very differently about these things that maybe we take for granted. And certainly that's going to happen. If there's anybody atheistic in here, one of the things we did an overview yesterday of the new course that we're doing on Thursdays, a philosophy of mind. And it might have come as a shock to some people to learn that, the majority of philosophy of mind focused philosophers think AI is either impossible or really far away. They're not really that impressed by the stuff that's come out recently that's got everybody all hot and bothered. Um, if you just live in the general public and you maybe have interacted with some sophomoric academic people, you might think, "Ooh, all of the intellectuals, they would never believe in God." That is just not the case. It's more the case that so I was thinking about what's the answer for why it seems like hoity-toity intellectuals are so materialistic and science worshiping and non-religious, and of course that's not the case. And the people in this class have already you came here probably because you've already done a lot of deep dives into very impressive intellectual people who did not have anything like that type of worldview. And you've certainly come across a few others since we've started, but why is that the public image? Why is that the general assumption? And I think it might be as simple as the following. What music is popular? The kind of music that's written for hormonal teenagers who want to be told that they should feel good and have no responsibility. Does that mean that those are the best musicians? No, it's just that's the stuff that's gonna sell a lot because those are the people with the money that they're gonna put into that type of thing the most. It's sort of the same thing with the philosophers. It's like the most sophisticated arguments are certainly not cartoonish, atheistic. There's certainly sophisticated atheistic arguments, and we're gonna be looking at some of them, and they're really powerful and worth wrestling with and worth studying and worth understanding. So I'm not saying there's no such thing. What I'm saying is, if you have a general view that, well, that's what every intellectual would think is in that camp, you're going to find that no, that's a small camp within what the big contributors have to say about this topic, and they're certainly not dominating anything. They're just sort of present and super valuable, and we wouldn't want to lose them. But that's just not as we get into studying this, you're going to find that there's all sorts of perspectives. There's people who think, well, this is a language problem and God talk is meaningless. They do that meta approach. There are people who think that they can prove God doesn't exist. There are people who think that, the only logical thing to do and the reasonable thing to do is to say he doesn't exist or to withhold judgment of it. That all of that stuff exists. There's all sorts of atheists with very good arguments and very interesting approaches. And if you, by the way, I'll make a second point right now. Well, I'll come back to it. So there's all sorts of positions like that that are really worth studying. And there's this old joke that there's only two people in the village who really believe in God: the rabbi and the village atheist. Right? Everybody else, it's like whatever. That's that God thing. I say I believe it because that's what makes me a person who can do trade and work with people because we all decided it's important to say. But there's only two people who really care about the idea and really think about it. There's definitely some truth to that. Um, I'll tell you, a while back, I used to hang out with friends, and some of them would say that they're atheists and things like that. And you won't know what I am, by the way. So when I say they would say they're atheists, that doesn't mean that I'm not one, right? I'm not going to tell you what I am. The If this course goes well, you won't know what I think about any of this. But they would say it, and I would say to them, I'd say, have you ever read the Bible? Have you ever read the King James version of the Bible? And of course, they're like, no. I go, well, you're not really an atheist. You don't know what it is that you don't believe. You just say you don't believe it. And that's not really being an atheist. Maybe I should have been kinder and said, or ruder, and said that's no way of being a sophisticated atheist. But how can you say you know something isn't true or that you don't believe something that you don't even know what it is? Maybe you do believe it. You don't know what it is. So how do you know? Um, and then there came a point where my serious religious friends would tell me that they were, Christians, and I would say, I don't know if you get to call yourself a Christian if you haven't read Nietzsche. I don't know if you get to call yourself a Christian if you haven't read a philosopher who has reasons for rejecting your perspective. So I don't know how fair that is, but oops, I let it go to sleep. One moment. My bad. Okay. So I don't know how fair that is of me, but I've been feeling there's a grain of truth in that I think animates and motivates me a great deal. Like um it's probably not the case that you can't fit into one of those categories without knowing the other, but certainly you'll be a more sophisticated version of either one of those if you know what the arguments are and you know how to participate in the conversation. You can keep up with what's going on and benefit from studying it. So, all right, that's the end of the slide. So I think we can kill that. Um, I have high expectations that we're all going to get a lot out of this course. I really think that this is one of the more interesting collection of things to look at in the year one material. Um, if it doesn't seem like that yet, it will very soon. I mean, I understand that it's possible for somebody to say, wait a minute, why am I going to get into these qualities, not qualities, these attributes of God if I basically generally know what I think about all this already? Um, it's surprisingly powerful. It's there's the development of logic and thinking tools that's a part of what's going on in this back and forth conversation between philosophy and theology. There's this like I said before, philosophy is sophisticating and criticizing religion and faith. Religion, sometimes there's a philosopher like Ghazali who comes along and says, "Hey, I'm gonna write a philosophy book, and I'm gonna look at everything philosophers think and say. I'm gonna use just the rules of philosophy and no articles of faith that come from revelation, and I'm going to prove that all philosophy is worthless and can never get you to the truth ever." Or like, what? So there's definitely some heavy hammer blows between these two, but there's also a lot of mutual appreciation and cooperation between them, right? St. Thomas Aquinas is going to say, hey, look, we've got all this theology to do. And I'm going to argue at the beginning of my book that all that's worth doing. And probably we can even know ahead of time that it's a path to truth, even though it's non philosophical. He'll argue philosophically that it is. And then he'll say, but let's do that now and let's do that for the rest of this book and let's just do philosophy. Let's not know that Adam was the first man in the sense of knowing his name. Let's not know anything from Revelation. Let's just know what can we know about God and what can we know about ourselves and what can we know about mortality and what can we know about angels and what can we know about all of these spiritual and religious terms, just doing philosophy. And Aquinas is the most represented author in this book. That doesn't mean he's like, I'm not trying to suggest he's my favorite or anything like that. He's fantastic, by the way. There's a reason why he's talked about all the time. So I'm not trying to disparage him either. But I want to say one other thing about him, which is in our year year two class, which is very different from this year one stuff. And I should make a note about that because it's the same note that we made yesterday. But in our year two material, one of the courses that goes along with that is a deep dive into Aquinas and his big philosophical work. So we'll have more reason to come to him in year two and do all of that. But so that's probably all to talk about the content and what we're going to cover. I'm going to make just one quick note, which I made yesterday, and I'll make it again. This is a year one course, so this is done in the exact same style that we talked about yesterday's intro course to philosophy of mind, which is that. How do I close out of that? Which is that we are cherry picking essays. They've been selected for us. They're in these sections that are big areas of the philosophy of religion. Clearly, you can tell from the sketch that there's obviously other sections too, other attributes of God, other things to consider, whole subjects that are only represented by one or two little essays discussing linguistic criticisms and meta criticisms and things like that. There's tons of other stuff, obviously. But it's a nice overview survey of the battlefield and the in the backbone course, it's kind of like 90% of the purpose of our reading is to say, let's make sure we've understood this author. Let's make sure we understand how they're arguing and the styles that they're using and what they think is an appropriate way to argue and how they're responding to the other authors and work out the ideas like that. And there's very, very little lecture on top of that. Um, but there's discussion about the topic itself. In these courses that complement it, it's more like 60-40, maybe 70-30, maybe 50-50. We really are going to focus on making sure we understand the arguments, that we understand what the ideas are, that we understand how each author is responding to each other. We're going to definitely spend time focusing on that, but we're also going to have a lot more discussion about what these things mean, what they mean to us, other ideas that we might introduce to the conversation. Say a little bit more of, hey, I like this guy's essay, but on this paragraph, I think he got it dead wrong. Let me make an argument that he's wrong, right? And so I'll be doing more of the putting on my hat of whatever author it is and trying to respond from his perspective while we have a lot more back and forth. The last note that would be worth making is one we didn't make yesterday, which is this. Hi, Internet. You get to come along on this course. But of course, we're reading the material in the course and you're the internet and you're a bunch of assholes. And what we want is a nice location where we can argue anything and test out ideas and stuff like that. So we have really long after conversations and sometimes really long pre conversations, but often we have very long after conversations when the recordings are over. And that's because we are, if you walked into a philosophy room, if we were actually all in the same room, it's a great atmosphere. It's an atmosphere where we're all looking for clever arguments and we're all looking to respond to them. And we're all trying to, you know, we're all, if we're good philosophers and if we're really helping the conversation, we're actually aimed at trying to find the truth and trying to find it through mutual appreciation of the arguments and criticisms that come from people who we also think are aimed at the truth and or who we at least pretend we think are aimed at the truth, if even if they're acting like they're not. We assume charitably that they are, and we say, look, we still have to answer your arguments. And it really becomes that argument and worship mean the same thing idea. And it's really beautiful. But the idea that you can just sort of do that in front of other people, no, you actually kind of have to have a closed room to do it in to a degree. And so we will be having very long and interesting after conversations. We'll do some of that before we end the recordings. It's not just going to be me reading an essay with people listening or something. We're going to stop. We're going to explain arguments. We're going to debate people. just so that you all know, there's a small group of people that are always the core students of any one of these things, and they already know. They just unmute and interrupt me at any time, and we'll start discussing something. So we're going to be reading the essays like that, and we're going to be discussing them to a degree. But after we're done and we end on the recording, you can't imagine how cool the conversations have been. And I do not want, there's no part of me that wishes that that was just broadcast to everybody, because it's just something that maybe, the internet doesn't deserve. So, so take a number and take a hike. Uh, I thought I'd explain that really quickly, since we didn't talk about that yesterday. Other than that, this is exactly like the course that we introduced yesterday, except, of course, that one's about philosophy of mind. This one's philosophy of religion. Our new calendar is every Thursday we'll be doing mind. Every Friday we'll be doing philosophy of religion, as we just outlined. And then every Tuesday, we'll be continuing that basic backbone 101 course where we get introduced to a lot of different subjects. So on that note, I'm going to shut up. I'm going to leave it open for questions, comments, things people want to say before we end the recording. And then we're going to go into an after conversation. So,
I have a question. So, first of all, I want to say that that was a really good introduction. So, kudos to you. I'm looking for clarification regarding ontological and cosmological arguments for the existence of God, because it seems to me, and it correct me wherever I'm wrong, of course, but cosmological is kind of a cause effect argument, right? And I'm not sure if that would be considered a rationalistic argument, but it seems like that's how that. Well,
not
that's a term I would
rationalistic.
use.
Okay, good.
No,
Awesome question. So we've got the
okay,
cosmological
but then but then
arguments.
on but then hold on. I know it's kind of a long-winded question, but so I want clarification. What is the major differences between cosmological argument for God,
Understood.
ontological argument for God, and then also from what I looked up while you were speaking, Thomas Aquinas, although I thought it would be more of a cosmological argument for God, apparently he's ontological. So yeah, I'm just
Aquinas
looking for
is
some
going to be giving the
clarification.
cosmological argument mostly. I think he has a short version of an ontological, but Anselm is the main guy that we go to for the ontological, although he's not the one who invented it, of course. He put it really well. So I understand your question perfectly. It's a great question. I'd love to talk about it. So we have the cosine of A and the ontangent of A. No, we have the a bad abbreviation for the cosmological arguments and the ontological arguments over here. To answer your question, um, the word rational should be over here. Oh, I can't write with my mouse apparently when it doesn't register. And this is more of an empirical. Okay. It's a synthetic inquiry. Okay, so the cosmological arguments, this is completely unfair what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, goes something like this. X, actually, why don't I use a little bit of notation here? X cannot exist unless there's a God. That's the first premise, maybe. The second premise is X exists. Therefore, there's a God. Okay. So that's unfair, but essentially, we can think of all of the formula of all the cosmological arguments. Now, that's me trying to broaden the concept of the cosmological argument a little bit. Okay, so the the most pure form of the cosmological argument goes something like all of the contingent things we see around us are the effects of causes. Everything causes other things. Those things are the causes of other things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That can't go back forever. It can't go back forever. There has to be a prime mover to knock over the first set of dominoes to make all of the other dominoes knock over, right? That's maybe the pure form of the cosmological argument in a sense. However, there's an awful lot of arguments that are also of this type of structure. So I'm going to make oops, I'm going to make a larger umbrella term of cosmological argument to say that there are apologists and theologians who will make any of the following arguments. Morality cannot exist unless there's a moral creator and a lawgiver to the universe. Morality certainly exists. Here's my arguments that morality exists. Therefore, there must be a moral creator that made everything, or a moral source of morality. And then they'll say something else, maybe. Your conscience, your sense of the moral right and wrong, also couldn't exist unless God created you to be able to sense, to have a moral faculty. That itself is different than just the morality, and that couldn't exist without a God who put it there. But because it exists, therefore God must exist. Um, the laws of reason cannot exist, some might say, some do say, unless there's a reasonable God that designed everything. Otherwise, it would just be chaotic and there'd be no reason to think that it would be reasonable. And how could that come about? The laws of cause and effect. Um, oh, geez, why am I tired? What's going on here? There's a dozen of them. The flagellum can't exist unless God, right? That's an argument from design, but so I'm going to make a broader category for this type of structure of X cannot exist unless there's a God. X exists, therefore there's a God. Um, what are some of the other ones? There's so many. I feel this is embarrassing.
No, that's fine. Hey, let me relieve you, but I'm deposed. I'm going to clarify my question a little bit or make a statement, let's say. So the ontological argument, it seems to me, is based on an assumed morality. Is that correct?
Mm.
Would you say that's
We haven't talked about the
somewhat correct?
ontological yet. No. So one of the things to notice about this argument here, that I'm saying the big umbrella term of cosmological arguments, is that there's an element of investigation. You have to go and examine and find out if it's true that X exists. That's one of the main differences between the ontological argument and this big umbrella term that I'm using for cosmological arguments, which there's maybe a subcategory, or maybe there's an overlap, or maybe there's just a totally different category of arguments from design. But this basic structure here has a synthetic element. Let's go look and see if the world is like the sort of world that could only exist if there is a God. The ontological argument requires no investigation of the world. That's what makes it so interestingly different as a category. I think there's a big, thick line between the design arguments and the cosmological arguments and the ontological argument. The ontological argument is an argument that people credit Anselm for. There's more than just a hint of it in other authors, including so let's talk about what the ontological argument is for a quick moment. So if I told you that all bachelors were unmarried men, you would say that's true. If I told you that God necessarily exists, you might not say it's true for the same reason. Here's how the ontological argument goes. Let's say we have person A and person B, and they're facing each other and they're having a conversation. And person A says, I would like to have this kind of a conversation. Would you like to engage with me in investigating whether or not God exists? And person B says, sure, that seems like a reasonable thing to do. And then person A says, aha, therefore God exists. That's the end of the argument. Now, one of the funny things about this argument is that people think it's a shell game. They think there's must be something wrong with the ideas or the language. It's a car salesman, creepy thing to do, and it can't possibly be logically right, and it can't possibly be a powerful argument. And yet, it actually is if you understand it. That doesn't mean we're saying it's right, but it's a very, very powerful argument. And here's how it works. Person B says, "Hey, you can't do that. You can't just go about saying for sure he exists just because I agreed to talk about him. We still have to go do all of those investigations over there and find out if he exists." And person A says, "Well, what is it that we're going to go and investigate to see if it exists? Person B says, I don't know. You want a definition of God? How about God, this really great entity that made everything. You know what I mean by God. And person A says, well, let's define it a little more specifically. Let's call it something so great that you can't imagine anything greater, right? So we don't know how great he is, but we know that whatever he is, he's greater than the greatest thing I can imagine. And person B says, fine. If that's the argument, if that's the definition you want to use for God, God is that the greater than which it is not possible to conceive. You cannot imagine something greater than God. And then person A says, okay, so you and I are agreed that we're going to discuss whether or not that thing exists in reality, whether or not it really exists. Yeah, that's what I want to get to. Can we get to it already? Says person B. And person A says, well, but you're not going to change the subject now. You're not going to go and talk about something that you can imagine something greater than it. You're going to talk just about the greatest thing, so great that you can't imagine anything greater. Like that's at least God's, at least that, right? Yeah, sure. No problem, says person B. I'm going to stick to that. I'm not going to change the subject. We're going to investigate whether or not the thing that's so great that I can't imagine anything greater, whether or not it really exists. And then person A says, all right, look, apparently you're a little dense here, and I'm gonna have to spell this out for you, but is it greater to exist or greater not to exist? And person B says, wait a minute, hold on, don't start some bullshit with me like that. No, no, you said we were gonna talk about the thing that's so great, I can't imagine anything greater. And if you're imagining that thing not existing, but you can also imagine it existing, clearly, that's the thing we're talking about. We're talking about the thing so great that you're in your imagination. It's so great you can't imagine anything greater, and it actually exists. Not the thing that great, but it doesn't exist because that's less great than the thing that does exist, that is that thing. And person B says, now hold the phone. You can't just use the definition to prove that the thing exists. There's clearly something wrong there. And then Anselm says, well, what's wrong with it? Well, it's not so much a shell game and a trick. Tell me what's wrong with that idea. Well, because we never investigated whether or not the thing really exists. Yeah, but what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about something so great that we can't imagine anything greater. Yeah, okay. Uh, and then Ansam just keeps saying, person A keeps saying, well, don't change the subject to something less great than that. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something that necessarily exists. Now, that sounds obviously like there's something wrong with it to most people. And one of the things that gets developed here is the concept of a necessary being.
I like this.
And the idea of a necessary being is different from a contingent being. And when you realize that what Anselm is talking about is a being that has to exist by its own necessity, that it doesn't require anything else to make it come into being, that's a part of the definition of God. It's a little bit different than just a language game, which it sounds like it is in the first version here. So let's not go into it anymore. If that argument seems really charlatany and unconvincing, I promise you it's only because I failed to present it well enough in this short amount of time. But by the time we get through reading the papers on it, we're actually going to read. When Anselm made that argument, there was a famous person who came around and immediately argued against it. And then Anselm responded to his arguments. And so we're going to be reading all three of those pieces. And we're gonna really look at this argument. But the distinction
Well,
that
hey,
we
thanks for
actually
your time. Hey, thanks for your attempt to explain and your diagrams and all that. But yeah, I'm kind of leaning towards the cosmological arguments, although I wouldn't define them the same way, maybe.
right, and we're gonna look at people who say, look, you guys are all messing up the whole point of theology, which is that it's supposed to be faith-based, and you're not supposed to have arguments for God's existence, because if you do, it'll take away our need for faith, and you've just ruined everything, right? So there's all sorts of different perspectives on all of this stuff, and we're gonna look at a lot of different perspectives here. But uh the ontological argument is not stupid, although it sounds like it might be when you first hear it. It's a really, really powerful thinking tool. And to Path's point about the question, is that it's a rationalist kind of a thing. It's a thing that you could do just by examining the content of the meaning of the ideas in your brain, which is, of course, reminding people of Descartes' argument for the existence of God, because that's what he did to get to there. And so, is he really just encoding Anselm's argument? But wait a minute, is Anselm just saying what Socrates was talking about? We have a lot to discuss. We have a lot to discuss, and we'll be discussing it when we get to those sections. But it's possible that the ontological argument points to um, something experiential, right? So usually we think of arguments for the existence of God as, like the cosmological argument from design. Here's an X, and here's the consequences, as just logical propositional things. But there's something intriguing about the ontological argument, because when Descartes wrote his Meditations, and in the third meditation got to proving that God exists, he did so in a rationalistic way. And we'll look at some of the connections between what Anselm was doing and what Descartes was doing. But then he has this very strange paragraph. Before he moves on to his next philosophical investigation, he has this paragraph where he says, now that we've cleared away all of our wrong ideas, now that we can see clearly a thing inside our brains that isn't like us at all, and isn't like anything we've ever experienced, let's glory and in the meditation of direct experience with this thing. So there's a mysticism to what Descartes was doing. It was a book that was partially mysticism. It was designed to induce within the reader, if they follow the philosophical arguments, a clarity of thinking that would allow them to have direct access to something divine. And then otherwise that paragraph just doesn't make sense why it's in there. Like, wait a minute, I thought we were arguing about the idea of God, not experiencing him. And so we there's something Platonic. Let's just sum it up that way. There's something very Aristotelian about the scholastics and Aquinas and the cosmological type arguments for God's existence. There's something very Platonic about the ontological argument. And so both of those threads are existing inside of the philosophy of religion and inside of theology. If we want to look one more time back here, we can say, look, um, religion includes theology, and theology includes caring about the rules of right reason. And so it's sort of religion inventing and becoming philosophical, or contributing and criticizing um, philosophy, participating in the game, right? So it's not like these things don't overlap, and overlap in both directions, right? We have prophetic philosophers, and we have logicians who develop their logic through their attempts to think clearly about theological concepts and make sense of revelation, and the logical consequences of verses and things like that in their holy texts. So there really is something intimate and unique and special about the relationship between philosophy and theology that I thought I don't I, I don't know if I'm giving answers about how it relates, but I thought it was worth considering how it relates, and bringing up the idea, and imagining it, and just sort of becoming conscious of that to some degree. So that allows us to tie back into that. So that's a really cool question. We will be able to talk a lot more about it. The ontological argument is, maybe I didn't do a very good job, but I'll tell you
No, you
this.
did fine. You did
Well,
great. But
I'll
but,
tell you
but
this.
we're going to get more into this, I'm sure. And
We
tell me
will.
whatever
We
you
will.
want to
But
say. That's fine.
what's interesting about Anselm is that if he's correct, we're all wasting our time looking for evidence of God's existence. The notion of God itself is either necessary or impossible, right? It's taking out all of that middle realm. It's from a theologian, from a philosopher who's religious. He's saying, okay, everybody who thinks about this God thing with different perspectives and arguments, all of you who think it's possible that God exists, that the idea isn't just a self-contradictory absurdity, right? If you think it's possible that he exists, he exists. He must do so. He must do. The only room that's left for you then if Anselm is correct, is to say the notion of God itself is an absurd notion. It's just self-contradictory. You think it means something, but it doesn't mean anything. But that's really clearing away an awful lot. If he's correct, and I think his argument is more powerful than people think it is. If he's correct, he's just cleared away 9/10 of the board. He said all of the people who say, "Oh yeah, the idea of God makes total sense, but I don't see evidence, or I see evidence he doesn't exist." But he could exist. If he could exist, he does exist. If Anselm is correct, so what you'd have to say is no, it's not possible that he exists. He's such a strange idea that we can examine that idea enough to know that it's just babbly nonsense and self-contradictory or absurd. There's no way such a thing
Oh, but
could
it's our
exist.
idea, though. It's
Well,
our
yeah.
idea. Right?
Okay, so that's a harder thing to argue, right? It's easier to argue he does or doesn't exist, and we agree on what we're talking about. But if Anselm is correct, what we have to do is say, no, God is like a square circle. You're talking nonsense. You think you know what you mean when you say square circle, but a square circle doesn't exist because a square circle is a self-contradictory absurdity. And if you examine your notion of God, it's like square circle. It doesn't really mean anything. That's a harder thing to argue. And if Anselm's correct, he's just pushed everybody away from the middle into one of those two positions. Either, of course, he exists, you can't deny it. It's like saying bachelors can be married. That's absurd. And Anselm makes this point. He says, this is why the Bible says, and he brings up a verse afterward. He's not arguing from it. He says, this is why the scriptures say, the fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Because Anselm thinks he can show clearly that by uttering the phrase God and understanding what it means, it includes existence in the notion. That should sound unconvincing to you right now, but we're going to examine his argument and see how he does it. It's much more powerful than people think. And if it does include existence in its notion, then the person who says God doesn't exist is really the one being self-contradictory. He can't even
Hey,
finish.
so I put you under pressure with a question or whatever, and it's a genuine question because I'm trying to understand the differences between cosmological and ontological arguments. However, I have to say that people say that you can't square a circle. Both of these are 360 degrees. You have the four right angles in a square, 90 degrees apiece. Multiply that by four, it's 360, which is the same thing. So you can literally fit a circle within a square, although they're definitely not the same thing. Now I'm getting too carpentry, but I'm
You
just
can
like
inscribe
trying
a
to speak
circle in a
about this.
square. You can inscribe a
Yeah,
square in a circle. You can do all sorts
yeah.
of things with squares and circles, but can you translate the area of a square into the area of a circle, or vice versa?
Would you
Elena,
agree?
No,
Would
no,
you
no. You
agree
can only
that
get 4 points. You can get 4 points touching of a circle and a square. That's all you can do.
that's
But
not a
was the
square
circle
again.
is bigger than the square? No, I'm not saying it is really, but I'm just being argumentative now, to be
No,
honest.
I
But
hear
I'm
you.
going
I
to
just
shut
heard
up.
you. No, you're good.
Let Elena
Elena,
talk.
I have this notion that in regards to the square circle uh, argument, that if we are to compare God to the notion of a square circle, then the closest thing that we can imagine as to exemplify God is consider a polyhedron that has infinite edges and vertices. It is
that infinite
seemingly a
part.
circle, but it is a polyhedron.
With calculus, perhaps we could do it. It's all really tricky with a straight edge and a compass.
Exactly. It can be drawn with the core tools of the Pythagoreans. So it is possible, it is feasible.
But so that's squaring the circle, but what about calling something a square circle? I mean, you've got a circle and you've got a square. If you can square the
No,
circle, you have a circle and a square with the same area. Congratulations. But is there such a thing as a square circle?
Honestly, it seems like trying to create an argument uh, like a, like no offense to your path, I honestly, but it seems that using the square circle as an argument, it is a bit childish, and I use this word with quotation marks. I mean, trying to deny and using something imaginary, something that cannot happen.
It's not even imaginary. That's the whole point. You can't even imagine a square circle. So the philosophers who make this argument are saying you're talking about God as if you know what you're talking about. But if we examine, and we'll make arguments that if we examine this notion of God, it's like talking about a square circle. It doesn't mean anything. You don't even have an idea in your head that it could mean, because it's contradictory to itself. It's absurd. And so if they're correct about that, and that's a pretty difficult thing to argue, right? That's pretty fringe compared to, I think there's more evidence for God or less evidence for God, right? Richard Dawkins says, let's investigate the world scientifically and see if there's a God. If Ansam is correct, as soon as you say that, he's won the argument and there must be a God, because if you know what you mean by God, you know it must mean something that necessarily exists. Again, it sounds like a charlatan thing to do, but it's not. So we'll get a chance to examine it, and it's actually one of the most interesting sections that we'll get into are the arguments for the ontological argument for God. It's one of the top 3 most interesting things we're going to be looking at in this course for sure. But
I'm looking
what
forward
he's
to
done
the
is he's cleared
geometry
away
of this.
the ground, Elena. So if he's correct, what he's saying is either you agree that there's a God, or you're just a fool, because clearly he must be, or the only ground left to you is this childish perspective that we're trying to outline right now, right? The only ground left for you is this idea, which you're saying is childish. It might not be. We have to look. And there's some serious philosophers who are trying to argue, look, I've examined this idea and it doesn't make sense. But that's the only room you have left if Ansam is correct. All of the middle ground of saying, hey, I agree, it would be worthwhile to debate it, well, then Ansam wins. If it's worthwhile to debate it, then you must have an idea of what it is, and you must think it's not self-contradictory. And there's certainly people who argue, look, you can say it's contradictory or absurd, but we all know what we're talking about. It's not. We have this notion, and this idea is, again, it's like that simple, pure thing that Descartes was after in his mind, that was not like anything he was or anything he had ever experienced. The evidence of that idea itself is of something infinite that must be, because how can I have an idea of it unless there's something like that in the world? I mean, it's very much that same argument. It's in that same Platonic tradition, and I think it goes all the way back to Socrates. It might go all the way back to Thales, but I don't mean the full argument in exactly that form, but this philosophical, psychological instinct to think in that way and to come to those same conclusions. It's an older tradition than just Ansam. But we'll get a chance to look at that too in this course.
The
Hey,
interesting
so
thing,
Wait, hold on.
my
Hold on.
autistic nature is I have to say a polyhedron is 3-dimensional. That's a sphere. That's like a ball, basketball, soccer ball. Those are polyhedrons, right? These are
Yeah, she's
3-dimensional
saying
balls.
take an
Whereas
octagon, take a decagon, take a dodecagon, take an infinitagon, right? An infinityagon is a circle. So it's just got straight sides, but all of the sides are infinitesimally small, and now it's a circle. Elena, what were you going to say?
okay.
that the interesting thing is that although you at the diagram that you the abbreviations that you noted, although you noted that ontological arguments are the rational ones while the cosmological are the empirical ones, you added to that category Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who are mainly characterological.
Well, wait a minute. I was trying to say Plato is more, the Platonic instinct is more on the ontological, while the Aristotelian is more on the cosmological, was what I was trying to suggest, that they're not
Oh,
in the
okay,
same category, right?
okay,
The
okay.
Aristotelian is, hey, right? Remember the painting, Plato's doing this and Aristotle's doing this. Aristotle's more like, hey, let's go investigate what we know about things that in the particulars, whereas whereas Plato is saying, oh, the great, right? So that rationalist instinct, the rationalist way of trying to interpret what Descartes was up to versus the empirical way of trying to interpret what Descartes was up to, the Platonic way of trying to understand what Socrates was doing and accomplishing versus the Aristotelian way, represent two psychological camps, two voices, two big voices within philosophy that are dialoguing with each other. And if we take that as a frame and a model, the ontologicals and the Platonic and the cosmological, I think. Now, that's not fair, of course, because the cosmological argument is very rational. It's not right in the sense that it uses reason. It gets pretty esoteric. It's kind of, I mean, we're talking about God here. We're talking about infinity. So it's not like he's saying let's investigate if frogs exist, right? It's like, well, all things exist as contingent beings that are caused by other things. Let's trace that back until we can get to the great uncaused cause, the great prime mover, right? So there's definitely, when the closer you get to the infinite, the closer you get to Socrates. The closer you get to the infinite, the further you are away from a sharp distinction between these two things. But as far as the philosophical, between the Platonic and Aristotelian, the closer you get to that consummation. So it's just maybe a feature of the fact that we're talking about God as the subject here of under discussion. But yeah, that's what I meant, is that the ontological is more of the Platonic tradition alive in that conversation, while the what my big term for the umbrella term of cosmological arguments, which sometimes people would take some of those and say they're design arguments, that is empirical investigation is a part of it, right? You say, well, maybe I'm living in a world where there are no moral laws, right? But if I'm living in a world where there are moral laws, that means there's a moral lawgiver. That's a maybe less sophisticated way of summing up that argument, but it's one of the arguments where it has a component of let's go and see what kind of world we live in, and that's a part of the premise of it. And so to me, that's Aristotelian. That's investigating things, not just in my mind like Descartes and Socrates. I can reach a thing that's, I mean, Socrates was rejecting physics and biology. He was rejecting mathematics as not high enough. The question of how we should live is a relational question. It's a thing that we can relate to, and it's the source of all truth, beauty, goodness, justice, and love. I mean, he's talking about getting in contact with the exact same type. I mean, Descartes is plagiarizing. It's not plagiarizing. That's a pejorative term, but Descartes is breathing new life into Socratic argument that was made in ancient Greece, when he does the same thing. And he says, let's clear away all of our misconceptions. Let's meditate and get to a direct encounter that we can glory in. And it's very experiential in the way he talks about it. But that's only after he does all of the hard philosophical argumentative work, which is exactly what Socrates said on the day of his death. Look, we've been arguing all these ethical questions, but we've been doing something else. And we've been doing that in service to this other thing. And that other thing is to relate properly to the source of all truth, being goodness, justice, and love. So, so in any case, we don't have to talk about this anymore. I almost wish that, so one of the things that is nice about this is that we will look at some stuff from Plato, and we will look. I don't think Aristotle makes uh, his presence here, but we will be looking at, but we're doing it in exactly the same way that we've been doing the year one stuff. We're just, hey, here's a guy from yesterday. Here's a guy from 2000 years ago. Here's a guy from here. And they're all sort of talking to each other in real time, which is one of the ways of understanding this philosophical conversation that I think is a useful lens sometimes. Instead of thinking of it as, well, these guys were trying to get somewhere, but then 100 years later or 1,000 years later, we really got somewhere. It's more like there's a big tent with 127 brilliant minds, and they're all conversing in real time with each other across millennia. And that's a useful way of thinking about it, but that's also necessary for what we're going to be doing, which is, letting them talk to each other. All right, why don't we end this more official thing, and then let's get into our groovy, awesome talking time. So I'm going to end the recording now.